told you there was a place in our universe where the creatures are made of glass, or that there's life forms that are invisible to us, but astronauts see them all the time. These invisible life forms aren't aliens on some faraway exoplanet. They are diatoms. They are these microalgae, little photosynthetic, intricately sculpted creatures that have houses made of glass that they make themselves. The thing that I love about these is just how beautiful they are. You can see these are triangle diatoms that I was able to film with a microscope. And they're just amazing little creatures that live here on Earth. And yeah, you can see them in swirls of ocean from space. So this is actually a shot from space of diatoms of microalgae swirling in the ocean. And so here's just another shot of this. Like, they come in all different shapes and sizes. They are oblongs and squares and triangles and circles. They're just amazing. And yeah, their outsides are made of glass. And they're just, this one reminds me of pasta. These are, I don't know, little orbs. They're just amazing. Where I found all of these little microalgae glass alien creatures was kind of at the edge of the world in Antarctica. And what I find so fascinating about looking at these tiny invisible creatures is that, you know, a lot of life on this planet is really at the edge of our sight, it's at the edge of our understanding, and in this case, it's at the edge of the world. And so I really wanted to go to Antarctica, and I wanted to go there partially because Antarctica is kind of this polar oasis, but people wouldn't normally think of it that way. Typically, when you think of Antarctica, you think of a place that's barren and lifeless, except for maybe a few penguins. But Antarctica is actually full of life. You just can't see it. It's just these little invisible weird creatures there. I really like things that are at the edges. This is one of my favorite images that I almost always show, because how many of you are familiar with this image? A number of you. Okay, for those that don't know, this is an image taken by one of my favorite spacecrafts, Voyager 1, a spacecraft that's gone to the edges of our solar system and beyond. And if you can see that tiny little pale blue speck of a pixel up there, that's actually Earth as seen from 4 billion miles away. So I always say that's where you can find me if you need me. But my background is not in science or space or anything like that. I actually, my background is I went to art school. I got my degree in graphic design. My dream job when I was 14, because I was a nerd, my dream job was to become an executive creative director. I was like, that's it. Like, to me, it meant you can be creative with the whole world. You can just be an awesome, creative, artsy, designy person and apply it to everything. That's what I thought at 14, at least. And so that's sort of how I got my start. But really, the thing that changed along the way was there was a time where I was at home and I was watching this documentary called When We Left Earth. It's this great documentary about NASA during the early days and how they were trying to figure out how to send humans into space for the very first time. And I was watching this, and as they were interviewing these guys in mission control from the 1960s, because they were all guys, they were talking about how they didn't know anything about spacecrafts or rocketry or orbits, and they were having to figure it out as they went along. And I was watching this, and I was like, I don't know anything about space exploration, and I want to work at NASA. That sounds amazing. And so I sent someone at NASA that I had never met from watching this documentary an email saying that I was a huge fan of what they were doing, and if they ever needed some weird, dorky, artsy girl like me, I was here. Never expected to hear back from that email. But serendipitously, I was able to get a job at NASA from that email. And it completely changed my life and my perspective. And it empowered me to believe that I could actually try and explore and sort of achieve my dreams from being 14 years old, of like being some weird artsy design creative person across the whole world. And now I could do that at NASA. So when I was working at NASA, I got access to a lot of astronauts. And when I was there, I was able to interview a lot of astronauts about, well, what is it like in space? And so I actually wrote a book a few years back about what's it like in space. And it was stories from astronauts who had been there about their more awkward, weird times that they had had in space. I wanted something that was not so serious, but something that was more about like, what is the day-to-day like? Do you get embarrassed if something weird happens on the space station? And stories like that. And I learned a lot from doing this book. Mostly, I learned that going to space is kind of like a camping trip from hell. And I don't like camping. So I decided maybe going to space is not really my thing. Maybe I don't want to be an astronaut. And so this is something that I get asked a lot. Is like, oh, you worked at NASA. Like, do you want to go to space? My honest answer is like, kind of no. I'm not really into camping, and I get so motion sick, I would be just throwing up the entire time. It wouldn't really be luxurious. But while I was at NASA, I learned that there's all these people who go to Antarctica and get to actually have something that's like going to Mars or going to an icy moon in our solar system. And that's because Antarctica is this huge desert world at the bottom of our planet, relatively speaking. And people do a lot of amazing research there that you can't do anywhere else. And so by learning that, I was like, maybe going to Antarctica is my version of going to space. Maybe that's my like astronaut moment. But I get to keep gravity, and I get to keep an atmosphere, and I don't have to throw up all the time. That sounds great. That'll be my thing. But I still was, this weird, art design student without a formal science background. And I still had to figure out how to go there. But I knew I didn't want to go there as a tourist. I wanted to go and contribute to science and contribute to understanding our natural world. I wanted to go there to be with the nerds. And so I had to figure out, like, how can I go to Antarctica but not as a tourist? And I discovered that the National Science Foundation had a grant called the Antarctic Artists and Writers Grant. And it sends artists down there, and it's a wonderful grant. It's on hiatus right now, but it's hopefully returning. And I then ran into my next problem, which was, okay, I went to art school, my degree's in graphic design, and you think of like the artists here where it's like, oh, a woman is sitting out in Antarctica and she's like drawing a picture and painting and just soaking in the landscape and just drawing what she sees. I suck at drawing. I am awful. I am terrible at it. And I was like, okay, so I went to art school, but I'm not good at drawing. I don't have a science background. Like, what am I going to do? So I decided, okay, well, to me, Antarctica is our portal to space. And so I applied for this grant, and I was like, okay, I've got it all together. I'm going to talk about how Antarctica is our portal to space, and I'm going to make this cool website, because I know how to make websites at least. And I'm going to talk about how Antarctica has like cool meteorites, and there's a neutrino detector, and there's all these like critters there, and it just is all like this portal to space. And so I did that, and it was, it got rejected. And so I was like, okay, what am I going to do now? So I then talked with more researchers about what it is that they do in Antarctica and what would they like to see. And I learned that while all these biologists go to Antarctica and they are able to tell us about all these amazing creatures that live there, sequence them, they rarely take any photos of them. They rarely take any videos of them. If they do, they take like 1 or 2 photos. Those photos end up in a scientific journal behind a paywall, and it's just not really, publicly available. And I learned that they would love to share all of these creatures that are in Antarctica with the world more, because a lot of people think there's no life there. And so I thought, okay, this is something I can do. I can become a microscopist. I can film these little creatures and show them to the world, and also in that way help researchers study behaviors and other things about them. And so I began teaching myself microscopy, and I sort of started developing a practice as becoming kind of like a wildlife filmmaker at the microbial scale. So as I was teaching myself microscopy and how to do different things, I realized that I could really use some help from other people. And that's so much of what I love about Eyeo and being here is just, there's all the things that you can learn on your own, which are really exciting, but really having a community of people to learn from just opens up so many more doors. So I learned after Googling for San Francisco, where I live, and microscopes, that there's a organization called the San Francisco Microscopical Society. Yeah, it's just as nerdy as it sounds. They got their start in 1870. And so I linked up with them, and I was like, hey, I'm trying to go to Antarctica to use microscopes, and I could use a lot of help. And they pointed me to Merritt College in Oakland, which is a community college, and they have a microscopy program there. And so I was able to go to Merritt College and get my certificate in optical microscopy and learn all these cool techniques and do cool things like, lighting up, different microscopic things with lasers. A lot of fun. So after all that, I was like, okay, I've got this. I know what my angle is. I'm going to reapply. And 5 years later, it took 5 years of applying for this grant to actually go to Antarctica, but I finally got there, and I got there soon after I spoke at Eyeo. So I feel like, there's some sort of putting things out into the universe, and they come back to you at Eyeo. And so I went to Antarctica with 185 pounds of gear, and this was a lot of my suitcases that I brought down there. It's mostly microscopes, lab equipment, and then barely some clothes to be there for 5 weeks. It was a lot. And so how do you go to Antarctica? So you actually go on a military aircraft. So this is a C-17 aircraft that I took to go down to Antarctica and film different creatures there. And so on these military aircrafts, they have no windows except for a tiny little porthole. And so as I'm flying down to Antarctica, this was actually the very first time I got to see Antarctica with my own eyes, was through this very tiny little porthole as we were flying in. And it's just gorgeous. But it's unlike so many places on Earth because there's no trees, there's no plants. It's really just a different sort of landscape. By this time, I had sort of become a microscopy geek. And when I got to Antarctica, they gave me my own lab, which is something I had never had before. And I was like, okay, I've got my own lab. I'm going to fill it with microscopes. And I kind of did. And my eyes were kind of bigger than my stomach. These are just a few. This isn't even all of them. This is just a few of the microscopes that I brought and that I had procured for me when I was there. Is just all microscopes. Yeah, I went a little overboard on it. And honestly, it spoiled me because when I got back from Antarctica, I was like, I've got to have my own lab space. So now I've got my own little studio lab space, which I'm really excited, called Field Lab. So getting to the meat of all this, what is it like in Antarctica other than cold? So in Antarctica, I was exploring all these different locations where all these creatures live under the ice. So this was one of them. This is the sea ice. And on the sea ice, they have these fish huts, which used to be used for fishing, but no longer. And these fish huts are used by divers. And these divers take these little piston bullies up to these fish huts on the sea ice. And this is what they look like inside. It's really amazing. So these fish huts essentially have warm air pumped through them, and they are able to keep a hole open in the ice for the divers. And the ice here is around 9 feet thick when I was there. So this is a 9 feet thick hole. You can sort of get an idea here with this video of just divers diving in, and then this is sort of like what it's like to descend all the way down, and then at the end of 9 feet, you are able to see the ocean, sort of, or at least the edge of the ice. So I worked with these divers to get this view under the ocean and get these microbes, but I wanted to actually be able to see what it's like under the ice for myself. But there's no way I'm going to be diving in like -2°C water, way too cold. And as I said, I don't really like camping. I don't even like being cold, but I knew I wanted to go to Antarctica. I knew it. But inserted into the ice is this long metal tube through the 9 feet thick ice that you can actually crawl down into, like a little Mario game, like do. So you crawl down 9 feet, but this is what you see on the other side. All those dots, those are fish. Those are just tons of fish. This is me just talking to camera, pointing to the fact that the ice above me is illuminated, and below me there's just a sea floor. And this is where things get like really amazing, because on the sea floor, you just see so many creatures, so much life. It is the opposite of a desert, even though it technically is. It's so much life and so beautiful, and you can hear the sounds of seals and all sorts of things. It was really incredible. And you can get really cool selfies with divers. Like, who doesn't love that? Yeah, this is what the ob tube, as it's called, looks like from the outside. So you can see it really is just this metal tube inserted into the sea ice. And yeah, if you're claustrophobic, probably not for you. So what are the creatures that I saw? I saw like things like this, seed shrimp. This is an ostracod. This is like a little critter with these little frilly fins that I love so much. They're just amazing. If you're wondering what that little bubble is there, it's just that. It's a little bubble attached to the ostracod. And then I saw even more of what I started with, all those triangle diatoms. Like, look how intricate they are. This one is actually an example of a dead diatom because the microalgae inside of it has since died. And this is what's really cool about them is those glass shells. They last nearly forever. There's just like millions of years of diatoms covering the sea floor, covering all different areas on Earth. And they look like this, and it's just amazing. There were also like creepy little shrimp-like things. Here's another ostracod. Again, just like a little bubble on it. And then other types of diatoms. And if you saw that one up there, it moved a little bit. And this is what's like mind-blowing to me. Some diatoms, they're microalgae, they move on their own. They just like twist around, like glide, do cool things. Some don't. And we still don't fully understand really the mechanisms of why. More things that are at the edges of our understanding. So next, I went into the dry valleys. And the dry valleys are a really special place in Antarctica. 98% of Antarctica is covered in snow and ice. But the dry valleys are the largest area of Antarctica that's not totally covered with snow and ice. And so you can actually see what the continent itself looks like underneath all of that ice. And it's amazing. So I flew in on a helicopter to Lake Bonny, which you can see here. And so this kind of shows you a little bit of what the camps actually look like out here in the dry valleys. So this is a little camp next to the frozen lake, and you can see those yellow tents. Those are the tents that we sleep in. You can see like a main building sort of off to the side. That's like the only main building in the whole camp. Maybe like 6 people will be at this camp at a given time. You can sort of see what it's like to come down for a landing. So this is what that camp looks like up close. A lot of these camps are entirely run by scientists, so that's kind of why they're as disorganized as they are. or at least that's what I think they are. They're not professionally managed. Sometimes there'll be someone at a camp, but a lot of times it's just the scientists left to their own devices, and so this is what it looks like. Lots of fuel and different supplies all around. So the thing that's really cool at Lake Bonny is this. How many of you have seen an image like this before? A few, but not many. All right, this place is like the coolest place in the coolest continent. This is Blood Falls, and this is a really unique place that happens only here, and it's this thing that for a long time, researchers didn't know what it was. They came across it, a long time ago, and they thought, oh, maybe that's algae pouring out of this glacier. Maybe it's some sort of weird life form. But they were able to discover over time that it's not algae coming out of this glacier, it's actually iron oxide. And what's interesting about that is that this is a subglacial lake. So underneath a huge glacier is a subglacial lake filled with iron oxide, and it kind of spurts up occasionally from that subglacial lake onto the surface, and when it does, the iron meets oxygen, becomes iron oxide, and produces this. But what's even more interesting about it is that once they discovered it was iron oxide, they thought, oh, there's no life there. It's totally dead. It's just a bunch of iron. There's nothing interesting there. But only in the last 10 to 15 years did they really discover that actually in that iron oxide, in that subglacial lake that's been cut off from the surface for a very long time, there's actually bacteria and all sorts of weird little bacteria things that dance around in it. So it was a dream of mine to go see Blood Falls in person. Yes, you can clap, it's okay. Sharing my geekiness. I was able to actually go and see Blood Falls in person, which was a total geek stream. And so this is what Blood Falls looks like kind of close up. So you can sort of see it's just all this beautiful palette that's just spurting out of this glacier and creating kind of this iron oxide dust everywhere. And this is what bacteria from Blood Falls looks like. So I was able to scoop up some of this, put it under my microscope, and you can actually see there's little bacteria dancing around. This is me being really happy seeing bacteria under my microscope like a nerd, and you can see it here. And, bacteria, while it's not the most interesting thing to look at, you can still sort of assign personalities to them and be oh, this one's dancing around, and this one's kind of depressed, and this one doesn't want to move, and this one's lazy, or this one is really happy and jittery. I don't know, maybe there's not a whole lot to do in Antarctica, so you get attached to your bacteria. Speaking of, not too many things to do in Antarctica, the thing that I discovered is that all these scientists that you would think use microscopes all the time, they actually don't get a chance to play around with microscopes. And so this is us at 3 a.m, because in Antarctica in the summer, the sun never sets. So this is 3 a.m, and it's just a bunch of scientists going wow, look at that under the microscope, and ew, my thumbnail looks disgusting, and whoa, did you see this? And then one even got on the floor, and they were trying to see if they could use a microscope to see their eye standing over them. Not exactly the safest thing, but they had a lot of fun. So that was something that was kind of eye-opening to me, was the fact that, doing something that I thought was so much I'm this newcomer coming into science, what new things do I have to bring? It turns out there's a lot of things that just researchers in their silos don't get to do much or play with much or really just have fun with. So while I was there, actually, one of the researchers was going to this place, which is Don Juan Pond, and it's one of the saltiest bodies of water on Earth. As far as we know, there's no life there, but we don't know for certain. So a lot of researchers are going to Don Juan Pond and trying to see, is there any life here? And if we do find life there, it could have huge implications for finding life on Mars and other places in our solar system and beyond. And so one of the things that was really great was they were able to bring back a sample from Don Juan Pond to me, and I was able to put it under my microscope. And this is what it looks like. Now, if you look really carefully, you might see an occasional little dot or something move here, And it could be Brownian motion, which means, just general motion, or it might actually be a little piece of life moving around. I don't know, I'm not a biologist, I can't say definitively, but I was able to show this to the researchers who were trying to see if they could find life in Don Juan Pond, and they got really excited. And having any sort of excitement when you're just kind of chugging away doing science for weeks down there is a huge boost. So it was really exciting to be able to kind of motivate them to keep looking, because to all of us, we were like, that kind of looks like it could be life, but we need to dig deeper. So the next place I went to in Antarctica was this place. This is Canada Glacier, even though it's not in Canada. And this glacier is this really beautiful, amazing place. And what's even more amazing about it was that I was able to hike up it in order to look for microbes. So this is me hiking up a glacier for the first time in my life. All of the scientists had pretty much bet that I wasn't going to be able to make it. I'm not exactly the most athletic, outdoorsy person, and remember, I hate camping. So I hiked up this glacier. I was able to actually do it. This is what I looked like really along the way. I'm in the red here, just fully covered while I'm hiking up this glacier. And why I wanted to do this was because the way microbes are on this glacier is fascinating. They are in these tiny holes called cryoconite holes all over the glacier. And cryoconite holes are essentially these things where little pieces of dirt get blown onto the glacier, and then the sun begins melting them down, and because they're a little bit darker than the ice surrounding them. And so the dirt sort of melts down into this soupy hole, and it creates sort of like a dirt puck at the bottom, and then it freezes over the top. So these cryoconite holes end up becoming like these little island universes of dirt, where each one is like its own self-contained ecosystem all across the glacier. And so we actually drilled into some of these cryoconite holes, not to get an ice core, but to get this dirt core, essentially. And all these pucks look something like this. And those pucks are just filled to the brim with creatures living embedded inside of the ice, just having a great time. I promise, I'll show you in a second. So this is what my lab looked like next to the glacier. They sort of have these small little boxes where you can get out from the cold and look at things. This is me pointing to something that I'll show you right now, which is a tardigrade. They are so adorable. This is a little tardigrade, also known as a water bear, also known as a moss piglet. And yeah, they have these little claws. This one's like climbing through a bunch of cyanobacteria, and they're just really fascinating. So this little dude was just like hanging out inside of a glacier, having a grand old time. Here's another thing of a tardigrade. Really cute, right? Like, they're gummy bears with claws is how I like to think of them. You know, if you've ever seen an image of a tardigrade, sometimes popular images of tardigrades go around and they look like these big, scary monsters. This is what they look like in motion under a microscope, just in a regular slide. So they're actually like really adorable and cute and wonderful things to look at. So that was found inside a glacier. Also inside the glacier are these weirdos. These are rotifers. And so tardigrades are little microscopic animals. Rotifers are also microscopic animals, actually in the animal kingdom. And they're like squishy, and they have these amazing mouths. And this is under dark field microscopy, so that essentially means I've made the background dark, and you can more see a lot of like the amazing colors that can come through with a different lighting technique. The thing that rotifers are known for, though, is their amazing crowns. So they have these crowns that they use to sort of suck in a bunch of food, and so they'll squish around, and then they'll try and like actually sweep in food into their mouths, kind of like a Roomba. And they're just these little Roombas that go around, and you can see something beating inside of it. That's not its heart. That's actually its esophagus. So whenever its esophagus is opening, it probably got like a little piece of food, and it's like, yummy. Here's another shot in bright field of these little critters. They're kind of creepy, but I don't know. They're just kind of amazing in how they're kind of built as an animal, I think. Other animals are like this. This is a ciliate. A ciliate is kind of what you can see. It's kind of just a round blob where you can see its entire insides, and you can see it pooping easily. Nearly all of these creatures, I have film of them pooping. It's a weird, thing that you're just going through your footage and you're just like, oh, excuse you. There's also nematodes. Nematodes are not like earthworms. They're their own thing, also a microscopic animal. And they move around in really interesting patterns because they don't have like the same sort of joints, so to speak, as an earthworm. These little critters, some of them have daggers inside of their mouths, and they will spearfish their prey and then suck out their insides using them. But nematodes are, there's nematodes that are more kind of evil and they, destroy things, and there's nematodes that are really helpful for soil. So nematodes, there's just a lot of them. And when I say there's a lot of them, I mean, think of every single human on this planet, every single one, 7 billion, however many we've got. For each one of you, there exists on this planet 57 billion nematodes. That's how many nematodes there are. Can't really categorize them as one thing or the other. There's just a lot of them. This is not a nematode. This is a cyanobacteria. That's kind of a spiral cyanobacteria. And you can sort of see them on Petri dishes, and they just look like party confetti got everywhere. And they also sort of like move on their own a little bit too. So one of the other places I went to in Antarctica was I actually went on sort of a robot road trip. I went on a road trip with a bunch of people who had a really fascinating robot. This was the team I went on a road trip with the robot. And here you can see the robot better. The robot is the big yellow column here. This is known as IceFin. And this robot is really cool because it's actually able to get into really tight places underneath the sea ice and actually see the underside of glaciers. So if you've been paying attention to some climate change news, you might have learned that glaciers are actually being cut away by the warm ocean underneath them. So as glaciers come out onto the sea ice, it's the warm ocean underneath them that's cutting into them and sort of slicing them off over time. This robot was really instrumental in helping figure that out. So it's a really interesting device to be able to use. So this is what it looks like inside a little tent that we set up, and the robot is going through the sea floor and seeing all these different creatures, all these crinoids and other weird things. You can also see on the edge, there's some frozen pizza. Like, you may be wondering, what's it like to eat in Antarctica? Or maybe you weren't, but, food in Antarctica, you have like good options, but really the only 24-hour option that you have for food is pizza, just all the time. So you just end up eating tons of pizza while you're doing field work. And so, yeah, this was really cool, and I liked it because to me, this is a way to do a deep sea expedition without being on a ship. And for someone like me, that's really, really great because, as I said, I get motion sick so much. So we're able to stay on the sea ice, not get on a ship, and still explore what's underneath. So I went to all these really fascinating places, and, it was a great experience. That's great for me, but I wanted to really bring it home and take people along for the journey because I do know that it's a very privileged position to be able to go to Antarctica, and with that, I think, comes a lot of responsibility for how do you take this home? How do you give people an experience and really show that Antarctica is not some exotic, faraway land, but actually part of our planet that we already kind of know and are familiar with? So I documented my expedition and was able to put it on YouTube as like a little mini-series. But more importantly, I wanted to show how all these weird little creatures that you can find in Antarctica, you can actually find all over. You can find them in your backyard, you can find them in your sidewalks, and they're actually not these, really weird creatures that you'll never interact with. They're actually things that you walk by every single day. So at the start of the pandemic, when everyone was staying home, I created a video for how anyone can find tardigrades in their local sidewalk cracks using just some basic materials and basic microscope. So this is me sort of like hunting for tardigrades with a cheese knife and a plastic bag, super fancy. And then here's, later on when I'm actually trying to find a tardigrade under the microscope. And to give you a sense of scale, tardigrades are typically, the ones I find are typically around 1/3 of a millimeter big. So teeny tiny. And if you can see here, like there's a picture of a tiny drop of water next to a penny. And then over here is that tiny drop of water. If you can see in the upper left of that tiny drop of water, like a little blip sort of next to the reflection, that's the tardigrade. So that gives you a sense of scale. So I put this out there, and the feedback was really amazing, especially at the start of the pandemic when people needed ways to connect and find joy and just have something that was also going to help, keep their kids entertained or keep themselves entertained. So, a lot of people were talking about, this is like a science adventure right in your own backyard. A lot of people bought their first microscopes thanks to this video, and a lot of people found their first tardigrades thanks to this video. And that was really fun. But as the output of my expedition, I really wanted to make it even more accessible for people because not everyone has a microscope. Most of us don't. And so I created lifeundertheice.org, which is a website that gives you the sense of what it's like to be in Antarctica and actually put a petri dish underneath your microscope and look around and find different creatures. So this is a bit of a tour of lifeundertheice.org, and you can see you can sort of scroll around, drag through things, zoom in and out of different microbes, and see what you can find all through your web browser. And this was a really fun project to put together, and then you can click on different things and say, what's this? And it'll tell you a little bit of information about the microbe and where it was found, and other things of that nature. So it was really a joy to be able to put together an interactive art project from a lot of this work and make it so that, microscopes don't even have to be the barrier to entry to really be able to explore and get this sense of discovering things on your own. These were some of the reactions to Life Under the Ice when it first launched. Giving you views of Antarctica that you've never seen. A lot of people haven't even seen any views of Antarctica. And this is what I really love about doing this work is because it shouldn't have to be this huge privilege to really know what all the different creatures look like all across our planet, even if they are in really remote locations. The next exciting thing is that this year, I am going back to Antarctica again. And I'm really excited. The first time I went for 5 weeks, now I'm going to be going for 8 weeks. And, even though I don't like camping and I don't like being cold, I really absolutely loved being there. I think, it's kind of like a geek jamboree. It's like being at Eyeo for 2 months. Like, who wouldn't want that? Like, it's amazing. So this time I'm going with a team called the McMurdo Dry Valleys LTER project, long-term ecological research project. And this group does some of the longest-term data collection about places in Antarctica. And so they do a lot of the data collection that tells us about climate change. And so they have different teams looking at like the atmosphere or the lakes. I'm going to be deploying with the soils team, looking at all the little critters in the soils of the dry valleys. And it's really going to be, I don't know, I'm looking forward to filming even more creatures than I did the first time. And this time with my expedition, what I'm really excited about is, thanks to support from National Geographic, I'm going to be producing a film about Antarctica at different orders of magnitude, inspired by the Eames's powers of 10. So this time, I'm not only going to be bringing microscopes, but I'm also going to be bringing a drone and looking at satellite imagery and actually giving people an insight into Antarctica inspired by the Eames powers of 10. So that project I'm really excited about. Yeah, thank you. So that'll be coming out, maybe next year or the year after. It's going to take a little while. But if you work in any type of media, museums or movie theaters or, what have you, and you would love to partner on this, please do get in touch because I do, as you can see with this type of work, really it's a labor of love of just trying to get it out into the world as much as possible so that Antarctica can no longer be this ooh, exotic place, but something where it's oh yeah, those tardigrades, I've seen them in my backyard. I know what Antarctica is like. It's all interconnected. So one of the things that I was asked in doing this work when I was talking with Ted was that someone asked me, is it your desire to create that drives you to explore, or is it your desire to explore that drives you to create? And to sort of bring it full circle, I thought about this, and I thought, well, it's really on a knife edge. I like both. But to me, as someone who dreamed of being an executive creative director, who I could just do anything and be creative anywhere and apply, my creative thinking skills to all sorts of things and mediums, to me, when I thought about it, for me, it's really my desire to create things is what drives me to explore. At the end of the day, I am a creator. I like building things in any way I can. Even if I'm not great at drawing, I like making websites, I like making events, I like making books, all sorts of things. And it's really that drive that really makes me insatiable about exploring things and pouring it into something that I make at the end of the day. So, thank you.